Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Johanna, and I'm from the UN Innovation Network. Thank you for joining this first webinar in 2021. And those of you who tune in somewhat regularly into our UNIN webinars, will know that one of the biggest supporters and advocates for innovation in the UN system is the Secretary General himself. He's made that clear through a lot of words and actions. He's hosted CEB discussions on innovation. He's commissioned the development of an innovation toolkit, a strategy on new technologies. He's established a high-level panel on digital cooperation. He's launched a data strategy. He's really done a lot in this space to encourage the entire UN system to think how we can use innovation to achieve the SDGs. And he's also been encouraging heads of all UN entities to invest in innovation and new technologies that can help them better deliver on their mandates. He's been encouraging them, and he's also been asking them to report on this through a very regular self-assessment that he's been running over the past 3 years. And he's asking things about, what progress have they made? What capacities have they put in place? Have they established any new partnerships? How are they driving culture change? So a whole array of questions that senior leaders have been answering very diligently for the past years. And we're excited to hear feedback from this latest capacity assessment today. And for the first time, this assessment has not only included questions on innovation, but also on data and digital capabilities. And I just want to start, as always, with a quick poll to find out how many of you are already familiar with this capacity assessment. It is the 3rd year that it's been running. So just asking a quick poll here. Who has heard of it? Who has maybe seen one of the past ones? Who is brand new to this? Let's help our presenters get a sense of where we are. Leaving this open for a couple more seconds. And here are the results for you. So it sounds like about half of colleagues on this call have not heard about it. So that's great. We'll give you an introduction to that. And about 15% have seen the previous ones. That's equally exciting. Very glad to hear that we have some colleagues who are familiar with that. Before I hand over, I want to briefly mention the Q&A function that we use here on Zoom. It is at the bottom of your screen. You can post any questions that you may have in there. And we also really want to encourage you to vote on other people's questions. So if you see a question in there that you're interested in, give it a like. It will bump it up in the question and answer queue and will help us get a sense of what is of interest to you. And some of you who have joined in the past, you will know that we try and make our conversations as interactive as possible. So leave your name. We'll try and give you the floor to ask the question yourself. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our presenters for the day. We are joined by Kersten Jauer. He's a Senior Planning Officer in the Executive Office of the Secretary General, and Tyler Porth, who's a health specialist at UNICEF, but currently on secondment to the EOSG, the Executive Office of the Secretary General, to support the rollout of the data strategy. And again, those of you who have joined webinars before, you may well remember Kersten. He's one of our most frequent webinar guests. I think this is his 4th one. He's in the past joined us for updates on previous capacity mappings, as well as an update on the Secretary General's data strategy. So welcome back, Kersten, and thank you for joining us, Tyler. And I'm handing over to you, Kersten.
Thank you, Johanna, for organizing this, and thank you, colleagues, for joining. Let me just a quick logistics question, Johanna. The screen share, is that still on, and can colleagues see it, or should I restart it?
Yeah, very clear.
Okay, great. Now, thank you for joining us on learning more about the state of innovation, data, and digital capacities in the UN system. It's actually the 3rd year we're running these assessments with chief executives, as Johanna explained, and the purpose is really to help us get a baseline understanding of where we are on capabilities that will in very many ways define the future of the UN system. And we hope through these assessments to support chief executives with recommendations on how they can improve. Now, we're going to show you a few headline insights here, but before I delve into that, let me first acknowledge the many colleagues who helped make these assessments happen, from UNICEF, from the Executive Office of the EOSG, from the UN Innovation Network, from UNDP, as well as the CEB Secretariat. Tyler is here today with us. I'd also like to recognize our colleague Jessica Summers, who's been working behind the scenes on this, and a whole group of interns who are helping make this happen. Now, today's presentation is a recap of what we shared in the SG Senior Management Group in January. So it's the very same insights that you will receive here. The deck is mostly focused on recommendations. Now, just a few words on context. Why are we doing this? Why is this important? And in many ways, what the SG and what senior leaders have in mind is to advance a set of cross-cutting agendas to help us build the capabilities that a next generation UN family will need to succeed. So it's in that context that we're doing those assessments to ensure that the UN family delivers impact, not just today, but also in the future. And at the heart of those conversations is, how do you drive change in our organizations? And in many ways, these organizations are the sum of our people, our processes, our technology platforms, cultures, and the partners we work with. Now, over the last few years, we have very much focused on changes in structure, in the peace and security pillar, in the development pillar, and in the management pillar. Now, as these reforms consolidate, we will increasingly shift focus to stronger cross-cutting capabilities that will be critical for success in the 21st century. So that is why we have put together a data strategy. That's why we're advancing an innovation agenda. But you'll see more where that came from, for example, on behavioral science, on strategic foresight, and on internal digital transformation. Because we believe that it's those cross-cutting capabilities that will enable us to deliver impact, not just today, but also in the future. Now, the capacity assessment is about our state of readiness and some of those core agendas. And let me say a little bit about what we're assessing there. I noticed that a number of colleagues had not seen this before. So traditionally, what we're looking at has been innovation capabilities. This year, we've placed a stronger focus on data and digital capacities. And we generally look at two buckets. We look at a set of enablers and capabilities, as well as cultural aspects inside of an organization. So, for example, we ask, what is the status of strategies? What is the status of people in organizational design changes, of partnerships, of implementation and policy and practice? And on the cultural side, we look at cultural attributes, leadership, engagement, and performance, as well as leadership practice. In total, we assess some 30 dimensions that are grouped up in these two buckets. And below that, there are actually 80 detailed elements. So it's quite a comprehensive assessment. It's not meant to be the end-all, be-all, but it's meant to be the beginning of a conversation between leaders on how they can move their organizations forward. Now, here's the highest level result. It's a matrix that shows all UN system entities along 4 quadrants of culture and capability strength. And each bubble here represents an entity, a UN family entity. And the size indicates the number of colleagues who work in that entity. And in blue, on the top right in that quadrant, you see leading entities, those who score relatively strongly on all aspects of culture and capability. And in red, on the bottom left, you see entities that are struggling, both on the cultural and on the capability front. And the yellow quadrant indicates where there are capability gaps, and the gray quadrant shows where there are culture gaps. Now, the key message this year from us to leaders has been that leading entities are pulling away. We see the gap between leaders and strugglers widening. We certainly see the risk of that in many cases. Only very few are catching up. There are 1 or 2 UN entities, in particular agencies, funds, and programs, who have made very deliberate and sustained investments in their data and digital and innovation capabilities, and they're moving quadrants. But on the whole, we don't see enough of that, and least of that in the UN Secretariat. So that is the big message this year. It was really a call to action and creating awareness that there is a risk that some of our entities risk being left behind as the pace and the complexity of change in the digital innovation and data space accelerates. Now, let me deep dive into a few more insights here to put some meat on that. So by now, we see that most entities have in fact clarified their vision and their strategies and plans on those topics. However, less than half have begun shifting significant resources or strengthened their internal governance. And most executives are putting innovation, data, and digital issues on their management agendas and are engaging in resource decisions. However, outside expertise is not sought often enough in those cases where it's needed most, for example, in struggling entities. So how do we learn about the things that we don't know how to do? Accountability of top management stays limited for now, in particular when we look at, for example, compacts with leadership. Key products and policies and guidelines are in place in less than half of the entities. So keyword here, for example, would be data privacy and data classification and security. Every second entity reports significant internal data sharing challenges, including with UN system colleagues. But top entities are far ahead on those data sharing capabilities. And centers of excellence help them race ahead. Clusters where colleagues come together to really hone and strengthen their skill and help others. Now, top entities have also created dedicated leadership, in other words, staffing roles on innovation, data, and digital topics. For example, chief digital officers or chief data or chief innovation officers. On the whole, though, the staffing needs that are unmet in data-focused roles, scientists, engineers, analysts, are very significant across the board. 73% of chief executives see significant unmet staffing needs, for example, for data analyst positions. Data competencies are not yet mainstreamed for non-specialist roles. So in other words, we want to see data competencies also being part of a political affairs officer profile, and that is in the making. Now, top entities can leverage their stronger capabilities to create value in more complex tasks, and Tyler will say a few words about that later. And when we look at the cultural aspects, in a nutshell, it's essentially the discouraging of risk-taking, the fostering of hierarchy, and the limiting of delegation of authority that are seen as key cultural constraints to change in the UN family. And on the whole, UN Secretariat entities tend to lag other CEB entities on that, and that's why we're very much focused and on a day-to-day basis and helping drive change where it matters most. Now, let me just say a few more words on staffing and give you an example for the UN Secretariat. In the UN Secretariat, at the moment, less than 5% of colleagues work in data-focused roles, for example, in information management. And when we looked at this in the senior management group, the ESG was very clear that probably as we move into the future, that percentage needs to move forward. Yeah? And we've set a first preliminary target around 10%. That would imply shifting around about 360 jobs per year over the next 5 years. And when you look at that chart here, you see that in principle, the humanitarian pillar is already far ahead. The largest needs in terms of new capabilities and skill sets in the specialized forms are in the peace and security pillar and the human rights pillar, as well as in the operations pillar. Now, let me hand it over to Tyler on some of the implications of that. Tyler, over to you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Kersten. So as Kersten was describing and setting the context and talking through some of the high-level takeaways, we wanted to then dive in to look at what are some of the practical consequences and implications of this. So hold on, I'm trying to make sure I can advance these slides. There we go. Okay. So for an example of looking at the practical consequences, let's start here with some of the data capabilities. As an example here, we see that lead entities are now close to highly capable and rapid dashboard deployment, while others still struggle with some of these basics. And for higher value tasks, such as the nowcasting, the impact modeling, resource optimization, and more, we really see two trends. So the first trend is that these gaps persist between lead and struggling entities. And the second one being that some of these complex tasks that we mentioned earlier remain out of reach for most. Even the best entities still have a way to go when we talk about optimizing with predictive data models and forecasting and nowcasting and some of the more advanced capabilities. And so one of the questions we've been asking ourselves to drive the implementation of the data strategy is how do we really improve on this? And so another key message that we have here is that you can't jump steps. A sustained shift in focus, resources, and effort is needed, and it's a gradual approach. We've also talked about how we recognize that broad scale transformation in this way is not a 1 or 2 year agenda. It's a decade-long agenda, and it's important to sustain a gradual approach to achieve that. So to illustrate that, we sometimes hear of pressures on teams to adopt, transform, or sometimes even outsource their work for machine learning and AI. And yes, of course, machine learning has huge potential for augmenting human capacity. But the reality is that machine learning requires solid data foundations and high quality data that is optimally accessible and connected in a flexible architecture. So in order to take advantage of the opportunities presented by more complex capabilities, we need to focus on building those solid foundations because those are truly the key to unlocking more value and move in a gradual approach, depending on where your depending on where your team and where your entity currently stands. Here are some suggestions on how you could begin the process of strengthening those capabilities. So first, we focus on the foundational tasks. So to highlight a few here, when we think through strategy and take a problem-driven, use case-focused approach. So the red pie charts here indicate many of the strugglers have not done that, while most of the lead entities, which are the pie charts shown in blue, have. Another takeaway here is that recruiting data analysts first before moving on to data scientists. And then focus on the data foundations. So here we talk about integrating pipelines. We talk about building the foundational data elements that allow you to have optimal access to high quality data. On the culture side, over to the right, we talk about engaging personally through your agendas and resource allocation and with outside experts, and advocating to change the core competencies of staff within your entity and within your team. And finally, supporting knowledge communities. So as an example, we've talked about in the data space how much value a network like the UN Innovation Network brings, and how we can create a similar model that allows better knowledge sharing and learning exchange across the UN system on some of the data elements as well. And once you have those solid foundations, then the objective is to become more systematic. That means that you bring data engineers on board to connect your data pipelines at a larger scale. It means creating dedicated teams to foster excellence, creating governance mechanisms to ensure your efforts are not fragmented, and finally, to demand cross-functional, project-focused collaboration where colleagues can join up based on issues and not based on org charts. And then for the leading entities and teams, the ones who have already invested in the foundational components, who have already made their work more systematic, the opportunity here is not just to double down on systematic tasks, but also then to become truly transformational in your potential. So this is where we talk about bringing on data scientists to harness the value of complex work, learning to make sense of unstructured data that may be in text, imagery, or sound, and then you can focus where you can capture the most value. This can be resource optimization. We can talk about risk management, modeling, nowcasting, and in the transformational stage, having dedicated leadership roles, including chief innovation, chief digital, and chief data officers, truly becomes very important to guide the work within each of the entities. One final note here is that it was interesting to see the poll results, and it's great to hear that we have so many people engaging in this for the first time. But just to flag too what has been happening with the sort of the sharing of these results up to date. So while each of us, each of you and each of your teams and entities, you have to chart your own path to improve your capabilities. We wanted to support that change. And so these scorecards, an example of what you're seeing on this screen here, have been shared with each of the UN entities so they can see where their capabilities and culture sit. For example, like on the quadrant chart that Kersten showed at the beginning of the presentation, as well as some of the individual components and insights. This lets you to see where your entity sits in comparison to the UN system average, but also where how it compares to some of the leading entities. So these have been shared with the heads of each UN entity to help target improvements that are tailored to each entity and team's needs. And we're hoping that, you know, for many of you, that this has already sparked some conversations internally. As Johanna was mentioning at the beginning, I'm sort of split between UNICEF and the SG's office in this role. And it's been great to see that the work coming out of this has been sparking conversations within the walls of UNICEF House, and I hope that it's been similarly provocative in discussions across the UN system. And then just for the last slide here, we wanted to provide some additional resources to make these available to you if you have questions about the UN system, the data strategy itself, and some of the implementation efforts and some of the resources around that, including the data governance group, which is a deputies level group that's trying to guide the implementation and decision making around implementing the data strategy, as well as some of the resources for the innovation work and some contacts over here on the right side of the slide. If you have questions about the data strategy, feel free to reach out to us at datastrategy@un.org. So with that, I will hand it back over to Kersten.
Thank you, Tyler. And that's really it. That completes our presentation. So that's what we shared with chief executives and what we're really happy to share with you. And we're looking forward to your questions. I can already see them popping up in the Q&A. So let me end here. Thank you very much. Johanna, over to you.
Thank you, Kersten. Tyler, a super interesting presentation as always, and indeed lots of questions coming in for you. If you would like to go on video, feel free. Otherwise, we're also happy for you to remain incognito. And Tyler, you've asked the top asked question already, but I just want to, put it out there explicitly again. When you showed slide 5 with all the bubbles, everyone was wondering, where am I on this chart? So you said the results were shared with heads of entities. Can you say a little bit more? So how would one go about getting them? Is it reaching out to the executive office? Do you know what colleagues usually do? Do they share them with the relevant teams in the organization? Are the results discussed? Do you have any insights on what executives do with that piece of paper that they're given at the CEB?
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a great question. I think, what we hope happens is that it is provided to the executive office, and that sparks discussion and dissemination of results of the assessment within each entity. I know in many cases that has been the case, but it's also very possible that not all relevant people have received those results. I do believe, I saw Kersten, I think, was pulling up, we have a slide that we can show which entities are sort of grouped within each of the quadrants, so that you can see that. And we can also, if you're interested in results about a specific entity and wanted to reach out to us at the data strategy email account, we could provide that quadrant, the scorecard for each of the entities that includes where your entity is located within that quadrant chart, and some of the individualized results from your entity as well. Kersten, anything you want to add?
Well, just to say, these assessments are really meant to be supporting a leadership conversation. So we're not going to be posting the labeled results, broadly. What we have done to facilitate the dissemination within entities, and I think the fact sheets are really the most relevant part here, is there is a network of focal points in each entity that has received them. I think it's typically about 3 colleagues per entity, plus leadership and leadership offices. And as Tyler said, in many entities, there have already been conversations then that are trickling down. We leave this up to the entities. So that's not something that we would do from our office. Just in terms of a general overview, I think on the quadrants, I think you can count that you're likely to see UN Secretariat entities more in the yellow or in the red quadrant, you're more likely to find entities, agencies, funds, or programs in the leadership quadrant. You're more likely to find, for example, some of the international financial institutions in the quadrant where there are strong capabilities but gaps in culture. So, but I'd really encourage you to seek that conversation inside of your entity. We'll see if we can find a way to share names of focal points, but as Tyler said, do reach out to us on the datastrategy@un.org email address. Thank you.
Thank you, Kersten, and we'll make that email address available in the sendout after this webinar as well. I would like to stick very briefly with the design and kind of conduct of the survey before going into the recommendations. And here I'd like to take a question from Tala from the WHO. Tala, you've been unmuted. If you'd like to ask the question yourself, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. This has been a very informative session. It's been really great to see that kind of data in a visual way. I wanted to know a little bit more about your data collection methodology, what kind of factors you took into consideration, the size of the organization, funding allocated for different teams that are involved in this kind of research, and the staff capacity. I think it would be quite interesting to see whether that would play a big role in the results of the research. And the resistance to change as well within the team itself and the organization. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me jump in here. I think there are at least two elements to an answer. I think one is to say that in the assessment, what we focus on is where are we now? So we assess essentially the state of a number of attributes, and I mentioned in total we have some 30 major aspects and then 80 detailed elements that we survey in what is essentially an informed, self-assessment. Now, the second element, I think, to an answer is to say that we are not in this assessment focusing very much on the why, on some of the underlying reasons. Yeah? For example, when it comes to some of the differences between entities, I think you might want to reflect on incentive structures that arise from funding, and from funding patterns. Some of the entities here rely heavily on assessed funding, which has the tremendous advantage of being predictable. But also has drawbacks that shape organizational culture. Then there are entities who are heavily reliant on voluntary contributions, which again has drawbacks, but it also has advantages. In this case, you're more likely to find the more, let's say, the entities more ahead of the crowd to be those who are more likely to rely on voluntary contributions, for example. So I just want to say there are two buckets here. In this assessment, we look at what is the status. We don't necessarily look into why is that from a large perspective. The funding patterns are one determining factor. Another important factor is leadership engagement that drives where entities place on the quadrant. And changes in basically in people and culture below that. Yeah, but happy to delve into this a little bit more. This is just meant to be a first answer. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And thank you, Tala, for your question. Sticking for a little while on the survey or the capacity assessment and what was asked and what wasn't, I'd like to now give the floor to Gustavo from the UPU. Gustavo, if you'd like to ask your question, please go ahead.
Yes, hello, thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, I mean, when I saw the graphic, mainly about the big gap between some of the UN agencies and especially those leading, I was asking myself if actually the main reason that of this could be the mindset, because as you were mentioning, if there is not the foundation for the innovation and maybe data analytics, you can have all the training, but the mindset should be there. And if there is a way you've been investigating or researching within your questionnaire this mindset. I mean, because soft skills are also important, not just structured data and hard information.
Yeah. Thank you. Maybe, Tyler, that's an opportunity to look at some of these cultural aspects. You know, I'd bring this up here if you want to talk through this a little bit.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Gustavo, for the question. It's super important because, you know, as you know, there are two axes on that quadrant chart. One of them is capabilities, and the other is culture. And I think a lot of what your question is getting at is having a culture that facilitates data and digital and innovative thinking. And so, in order to assess that, what we try to do is tease out some of the different elements of people and culture and decision-making practices to try to allow entities to assess themselves on their organization's cultural attributes. And I think you can see, I think you're seeing the screen or the slide shared here. We looked at some of these different components of that. So the value for external partnerships, commitment to data innovation and digital change, whether or not they foster cross-functional collaboration, nurturing knowledge sharing and exchange, persistent about evidence-based decisions, whether or not they're seeking to be truly innovative, emphasizing iterative action and agile revisions, which I think is a really critical one, whether or not they believe they're fast to adopt new initiatives, whether there's a culture around challenging the status quo, whether or not it's a culture that values and prizes delegation of tasks and decision-making, and similarly, they're flat structure over hierarchy, and sort of risk permitting versus being risk averse. So what we're trying to get to with these questions is not just to say, you know, your culture is good or very good or could be better, but trying to look within, you know, what are the components that make up a strong culture that facilitates and enables some of that innovative work to really flourish. And these are the elements that were outlined through some of the innovation work that's been developed in the UN system, as well as in the data strategy from the SG that was launched last year. So this has enabled us to look not just at culture as a whole, but tease out some of the individual components that can enable entities to see not just, you know, it's great to know that you should improve your culture, but this hopefully provides a little bit more guidance and tailoring to senior decision makers on where are some of the elements that they can really focus on to sort of transform that culture to enable more innovative and data and digitally inclined work to advance.
Thank you, Tyler. I very much appreciate it. The importance of culture really cannot be overemphasized when we're talking about innovation and data and adopting these new approaches. I would like to give the floor to our colleague Henriette from UNDP with a question on comparability.
Hi, Joanna. I'm no longer with UNDP. I'm actually now working as a consultant with the UN Secretariat. But this is a question basically looking at a multi-year perspective and saying, like, if you look at this inventory capacity mapping and you compare it last year and the year before, and maybe also you start extrapolating to the future, what are the trends that you're seeing? Because ultimately, I mean, I'm just looking from a small thing, having worked on data standards for financial reporting. Everybody looks at their own thing, but like, are we as UN catching up vis-a-vis where the world expects us to be or where we think we should be? Or are we actually, we are improving, but we're not improving fast enough because the world is still running ahead further from us? Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Henriette, and great to hear your voice again on this call. And looking forward to catching up on some of the trends. So this key, I think we need to put some nuance to an answer. I think first is that we definitely see movement, and I hope that many of you have seen leadership engaged on these topics over the last, let's say, at least 3 years in ways that this hasn't been the case in the past. You certainly see the SG far ahead on global digital cooperation, on data, on innovation, and other topics that were also making part of the common agenda that will hopefully guide the work of the international community in the years ahead. So there is definitely awareness and engagement on the leadership front. You also see that then translate into people thinking through how we're going to go about that. So strategies are in place, as I mentioned. So there's definitely a trend here of starting to think that being engaged, thinking it through. Now, the key challenge is the implementation of strategy into action. And that's a genuinely complex topic for any organization, maybe particularly for some of us. We see the same thing on standards, right? Standard implementation, it's hard to get to the standard, and then enforcing it is probably as hard or harder. Though I do want to say, so this is a few things on the, let's say, the positive or the encouraging side. There are also a few things that that have us worried. So I think we highlighted very clearly this year that there is a risk of, in particular, smaller entities being left behind, or maybe I should nuance this in saying there are some entities who have invested consistently over the past years and are now reaping the fruits of their investment in new kinds of capabilities and products and insights they're able to deliver. And those who have not done that, the longer they wait, the harder it'll become for them to catch up. And as a result, we see that gap growing within the UN system. And I would also say there is a gap, there is a chance that while we're moving as a UN system, we're not moving fast enough. And that will be a struggle for relevance in the 21st century. It's critical for us to catch up on that, which is exactly why in a second wave of change, where we want to put these cross-cutting agendas smack in the middle of what we focus on when it comes to change. I hope that starts clarifying a little bit. Over.
Thank you, Kersten. Very much appreciated. I'd like to step a little bit away from the comparability and the design of the capacity assessment and dive into the recommendations. And for that, I'm going to give the floor to Christoph from ESCAP. Christoph, thanks for joining us. You have asked the top-rated question, and thanks for joining us after hours in Bangkok time. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. Thank you for organizing this event. Just one question. You mentioned there were around, I think, 360 posts might need to be upskilled. So I'm just wondering, in terms of the training that will be offered in the future, what are the plans for that? Thank you.
Yeah. So I think there are two pathways to improving competencies and skill sets in an organization. One is training. And in the context of the data strategy, we are setting up a range of work streams to advance some of this enabling work. There are two on training, in fact, that are focused on basically mapping existing, or they are really focused on getting to scale in training, yeah, by ensuring that we have a shared understanding of the training opportunities that we have, for example, already contracted. So people don't have to, colleagues don't have to do double work in procurement. They are focused on coming on pooling resources for training so that we can get to scale and lower unit costs. And they are focused on longer term learning strategies. Now, I can speak a little bit to the UN Secretariat. In the UN Secretariat, colleagues have launched a learning needs assessment that was very comprehensive and well done last year. There is work ongoing on a learning strategy. There is work ongoing on a new competency framework for the UN Secretariat that will place analytics capabilities smack in the middle of what is expected of all of us. And we are working with OHR and the capacity development team in DOS to now detail out some of the training offerings. We also have conversations with the staff college on that. I think on the data and digital front, there's a lot of training out there that we don't need to recreate in the UN Secretariat. We also benefit from a great partnership with LinkedIn Learning that makes a lot of that already available for free. We have curated some learning paths. We're also looking into changes in some of the large-scale organizational training courses, for example, the SMART program that will now be called the Ethos program. So that work is ramping up. That's the first pathway. I also want to flag here in this context that we have worked in the UN Secretariat with colleagues on a new set of job profiles for data analysts, scientists, and engineers at levels G5 to G7, P1 to P5. They are available. They are already available on iSeek. We're going to communicate more broadly on this week. And I mention that because basically anyone who has a vacant post, be it XP or an assessed budget post, can use those job profiles immediately without hesitation or obstacle to already start changing, bringing on board colleagues on temporary appointments, which will help you move ahead for a year or two. And we're working with DOS colleagues and DMSPC colleagues on helping everyone understand how to reclassify positions in the long term. So there's definitely work ongoing here in supporting the competency and skill shift that's meaningful and can help you make a difference in the work of your team in the very short term. Over.
Thank you, Kersten, very much appreciated. And the publicly available job profiles will surely come in very handy, and maybe we can include them in the follow-up from this webinar as well to share them with colleagues in case there's interest. I'd like to piggyback on that, a question from a colleague who did not provide their name, and he's wondering if there has been any discussion around making trainings mandatory. He's saying there's a lot of data analytics and IT skills. Refresher trainings would be very helpful, but he's sensing there's some resistance to change. So has there been any discussion around mandatory trainings for data and IT skills in general?
Yeah, maybe just very briefly on that, just also speaking for the UN Secretariat. Well, on the one hand, I think there's an instinct and often an intuitive reaction, and I can fully understand that, to say, okay, let's make some of this mandatory. We are mindful of the proliferation of mandatory trainings. I think currently there is about a dozen that colleagues are meant to take when they join or regularly refresh. The broader that catalog becomes, I think there's a risk that it becomes less and less impactful. Our pathway here to making sure that data skills and literacy and savviness is mainstreamed across the organization are changes in the competency framework. And that work is ongoing. There are consultations ongoing. If I encourage you to look at your inboxes and Google for a competency framework survey, where you can share your views and your voice on what a competency framework of the future should look like. Because once you have that in place, and I think that's a fairly short-term exercise, that will start changing expectations, both in terms of hiring and in ongoing performance evaluation. But I do say, maybe on the training courses, as I mentioned, we'll be working to already catalyze some shifts in training this year, to give colleagues a taste of what could a different training offering look like.
Sounds exciting. We're looking forward to that. I'm going to continue with a question from Gracia here. It's currently the top-rated question. Gracia, you'll be able to take the floor in a moment, but also looking at, we have a lot of open questions here. Colleagues, if you are interested in any of these questions, please give them a like, help us to make sure we are taking the ones that are of most interest to you. And for now, Gracia, that is your question. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Joanna. So actually what I'm asking is about the collaboration or integration of the existing UN data platforms. And also, like, I think it's also the same situation here in regarding innovation, digital and data, I mean, across UN agencies. Because I was thinking, do we have this existing mapping or planning to integrate all the existing UN data platforms across agencies? Because first, that if we have this unified platform, we can have accumulative users, which can actually attract more users for the future. The second is like we can attract even colleagues from different teams to work on the data. And last time we have a call with our regional colleagues, and some colleagues saying they need some GIS data from like very small scale, like from village or community. They're collecting, but if we don't have this unified platform, they just keep it for themselves. and that could be the waste. So my question is just about what's your integration and a mapping plan of the existing UN platforms? Thank you.
Thank you. I see Tyler smiling also on this question. Thank you, Gracia, for that. It's actually a topic that we're very focused on to create some management awareness. And I think in many ways the argument that we're making and the insights that we're sharing, they're similar to what you're suggesting. It's actually at the heart of it is a data governance challenge. Yeah. So let me give you a little bit of a story here on how we've been surfacing this insight around we need to really combat fragmentation and unlock impact at scale. In the UN Secretariat, we've run a use case scanning exercise to support the implementation of the data strategy. So that meant looking at data challenges and priorities across departments and offices. We had some 24 offices participating, some 90 use cases surfaced, and the key insight was tremendous fragmentation. There are many colleagues who work in different corners of the organization trying to tackle very similar challenges, often without adequate support or knowledge and buy-in. And as you say, a lot of effort is lost in fragmentation. So the big first task that we want to tackle through the data governance forum is to try and deal with some of that fragmentation so that we get to better scale. And let me just put one slide here to give you an example of that. I don't know if this will come up here. So I think on the one hand, it's good that each entity individually builds its capacity, and in many cases that entails putting up a data portal. And I think that's okay, that's entirely okay. But we also need to think through to what extent do we provide a unified entry point where all of those different data portals can deliver data to a place where stakeholders can benefit at scale. You know, many governments have figured out how to do that. We have some UN entities who have figured out how to do that. And in the year 2021, we're going to be advancing through the UN SDG with support of the Deputy EOSG and through the data governance group, some discussions on, well, how do we turn what risks becoming a Swiss cheese into something really attractive and tasty for the global community that helps everyone leverage UN data better, and combating fragmentation is definitely at the heart of that. And ultimately, I think, let me just say one last word on that. It's about leaders understanding that data represents a strategic asset that needs to be managed and governed and nurtured like all other strategic assets, be it people, finance, and so on. And ultimately, it's a governance task, combating fragmentation, and that means getting leadership engaged and helping them understand why that matters. And we're focused on that in our entities, and we're looking for advocates across the UN family to help everyone understand why that matters most. We'll also share through, after the conversation here, some slides that we're using to illustrate that topic. Over.
Thank you very much, Kersten. I'm still looking at a lot of questions here, and I'd like to deviate a little bit away from the specific data element and come back to the capacity assessment overall. And I have two related questions here from Kersten and Shaini. And Kersten is wondering, how can we enable those in the struggling category? And Shane is wondering, what were the specific factors that propelled funds and program much further along the path compared to the UN Secretariat? So very much related, how do colleagues push themselves out of that corner to become a leader in the innovation space, or at least not be a lagger?
Yeah, thank you on that. And that's, I think, what Tyler emphasized, that what's important here is a gradual approach, and there are actions tailored to where you find yourself, where your entity finds itself on the quadrant, that will help you move forward. And the fact sheets that we have distributed also make that clear. In fact, I think in many ways they set out a very clear pathway to help everyone understand, how do I improve my placement on the quadrant? Yeah. Tyler walked through some of those insights. I think the overall thing here to emphasize is it's important to not to try and jump steps. We're not going to be machine learning AI experts tomorrow and be transforming our organizations, for example, unless we've sorted out the foundations. It is not useful to hire a data scientist and hope that this will fix your problem if you do not have data pipelines organized. And so from our perspective and focused on this particular product, the best pathway to understanding how to improve is to look at some of those slides that we shared today, because they are meant to be leadership recommendations on what to do, and to have a look at the fact sheets for each specific organization. I don't know, Tyler, if you want to add on here anything that I missed.
Yeah, no, I think this is a great question, and it's kind of at the core of what we've been trying to do. And I think one of the things that's also important is, we see that the lead entities are leading now because of, as Kersten was mentioning earlier, sort of a sustained commitment to this gradual approach, including sort of the investment in some of the data foundations. And that's what we're advocating for in this sort of like tiered approach that entities can tailor to their own sort of where they find themselves currently. But another thing that we're trying to do to really catalyze this effort is, we saw, Kersten mentioned the use case mapping that we did earlier this year. And what we find is that a lot of entities are trying to do similar things and have similar constraints that are preventing them from being able to do it. And so we're trying to bring the UN system together to address some of these more collective challenges more systematically. So that's where we're looking at, we're talking about, investments in data architecture. We're talking about sort of reviewing standards. We had the example of geospatial data earlier. We don't even have common codes for country names or entity names or shapefiles or anything like that. And so trying to address some of these things systematically so that it's not each entity left to do it on their own. And that's why we've also put some of these governance groups in place. There's the data governance group and data action groups to try to help share some of these good practices across the organization and support efforts to address some of these data foundations collectively.
Yeah. And maybe just to unpack this, a little bit more, let me just show you, each leader also received a more detailed deck that showed sort of the detailed survey results. And the way they're always structured, and Tyler showed some of that, is to help everyone understand where does a typical entity stand, where are the top entities, and where are those who are scoring lowest on the quadrant. And that helps everyone understand, aha, okay, I haven't yet, most top entities have formulated a strategy on innovation data or digital, even though on digital less so. Well, if I find myself in the bottom quadrant, well, let's tackle that. Yeah. And so that goes through here to all the detailed elements that we talked to before, where everyone can understand, okay, if I find myself in the bottom quadrant, what do I need to focus on most? Where do I lag most? Yeah. For example, on dedicated leadership roles, as that becomes more relevant, more entities need to be moving to where the top entities are. So the survey is really meant to be action focused and recommendation focused to help managers systematically move from one quadrant to the next. Over.
Thank you, Kersten, and thanks for going into that detail again. You said earlier that the results were shared with, I believe it was 3 colleagues from each organization. Do you think it's possible to get a list of the actions that were recommended, not for a specific organization, but the ones that the ladder, the steps along the journey that you recommended we follow and not skipped? Is that something that can be shared?
Sure. I mean, in many ways, I hope that's what that is what we'll definitely share the deck after this. And in many ways, the key recommendations are contained on the slides here that we showed, which help everyone understand. We broke this down into 3 buckets: foundational tasks, systematic, transformational work, and what some of those key tasks are. And you can also use these little Harvey balls to understand, how to prioritize and what needs to be done first. I hope that already goes a long way to helping everyone, chart a path forward.
Fantastic. I'm sure it will. Thank you. I have two more questions for you. The first one comes from Juan from UNOPS in Copenhagen. Juan, you should be able to talk.
Hi, can you hear me well?
Loud and clear.
Perfect.
Please go ahead.
Everybody, thank you for the presentation. Been learning a lot regarding current status of UN system capacity. So I just wanted to know if you got some insights regarding the differences within each organization between the headquarters and the field offices, and we can see that even though there's strategies in place, there's capacity in terms of data and digitalization. Sometimes there's big gaps between these two type of business units. Thank you.
Well, thank you for raising that. This year's survey did not focus on differences within organizations, and thank you for the inspiration. We'll keep that in mind as we involve this assessment, which, as we said, is an annual exercise into the future to also better understand some of the differences within. I do want to flag that our colleagues from the Development Cooperation Office have, for example, taken this assessment as an inspiration and have been running a data-focused assessment across UN country teams that will give us some greater insight on how things are trickling down, but it's definitely a path for us to pursue in the future. So thank you for that inspiration.
Thank you, Kersten. And a nice segue, handing over to Kat from DCO.
Hi, thanks, Johanna, and thanks, Tyler and Kersten. It's two things. I think my larger question was going to be about how we close the gap between the entities that are leading and lagging by providing incentives, perhaps, for more collaboration. But I think this is a ground that's already been sort of covered through the other questions about platforms and fragmentation. But it would be good, given that, considering that we might have to experience the inevitable belt tightening and budgets, etc., coming up, that we do share the platforms that are the most matured. And you highlighted the humanitarians. They have a fantastic data exchange, for example, that could be a platform for all entities. And it's really about leveraging the infrastructure that's already there, rather than creating asking every entity to come up with their own platform that works for similar purposes. But I also wanted to underscore Juan's point here, because I had the pleasure of filling in part of this survey for DCO, and it really created some heated discussions about bringing everybody along, because I think what you observed at the system level is also happening internally, where there are fast-moving units within an entity that are doing fantastic work, but the entity as a whole, we're still not kind of moving at the same pace across the organizations. I think one of the reasons has been this slide that you offered on the cross-cutting agendas for a new sort of workforce and future UN. This is the first time, well, I first saw this slide maybe only a few weeks ago, and I wish I'd saw it when I started with DCO a year and a half ago. This vision was not sort of well communicated, even within the Secretariat, so maybe it was still brewing at the time. But I think now that we have it, we really have to kind of propagandize it everywhere, because I don't think this message about the next generation UN is percolating down, and probably not in the divide between field and headquarters especially. So let me stop there.
Yeah, no, thank you, Kat, and thank you for all the work that you and the team are doing in supporting that. So on this next generation UN vision, you're absolutely right. This is something that's germinating, that's not yet running at scale, and we will work over the course of 2021 to spread the message at larger scale, and opportunities like the one today are part of that. So so that's the first, because I think there's a real determination that we move from or that we consolidate what we've done on the structural side and basically build stronger capabilities on top of better structures. Now, also to support your point on incentives, I mean, just to share, put up one slide here on how do we create incentives, right? So governance is an important pathway to creating incentives for getting stuff to scale, clustering use cases, pooling resources, policy changes, sharing, including through a UN innovation network or something that we build, that we model on UNIN, and technology sharing. I want to mention that partners and donors will also play an important, or member states will play an important part in that. And even sometimes entities that you think, or fora that you think would not be so change focused, can be supportive. So for example, in the UN Secretariat, the UN the Committee for Administrative and Budgetary Questions, the ACABQ, in its last report was focused on how do we support rejuvenation in the UN Secretariat and a shift in skill change, and how can we bring more new talent on board, younger talent on board. And partners are incredibly important. We are spinning up some strategic partnerships that we hope will help us leverage technology across. And we're also in conversations with donors about joining up and pooling resources to help us drive change at scale. So absolutely support everything that you've laid out here. Over.
Thank you, Kersten. And it's great to see that this is the beginning of a journey, but by no means the end. With that, I realize there are a lot of questions that we haven't had a chance to get to yet, but we are over time, and try and not take too much of your time. We know you are very busy. So thank you to you and Tyler for joining us today, for sharing this with us. We really, really appreciate the commitment to kind of make sure that messages from the very top also get cascaded down to the network and all the practitioners on the ground. Really, really appreciate it. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you so much, Joanna, and thank you so much, colleagues, for joining us. This has been a great opportunity. I saw we've gone well beyond 200 participants on this call, and very much appreciate you coming together and listening to some of what we've been working on. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks
and
so
colleagues,
much,
thanks
everyone.
again also for Thanks, Tyler. Thanks for joining us. We'll be sharing a presentation and a recording, as well as the contact details from the data strategy team. So if you have any questions about the strategy or about the capacity assessment,